Standing up in McKinney, this is According to Callus, episode 650, coming to you on the D-day 80th anniversary. Today would normally be a day that I would talk about a movie or a book, and I just so happen to have, I would call it a long-form video on YouTube, which I'm going to count as a movie. We'll get to that here in just a minute. In the meantime, let me remind you the best thing you can do to help me, the best thing we can do to get our voices heard is to like, share, and subscribe to this here podcast. Follow me on your podcatcher of choice, subscribing there, right? Sharing it to your friends on the social medias. And as a reminder, I have a group and a page at Facebook. I'm a pro at Gab, and I drop in at MeWe. And I got to say, the last couple of days been quite busy, and I have not done a good job of sharing the program. And, you know, the shadow ban, it's been brutal, but we're going to get past this. We're going to move on. Sooner or later, we're going to break through it on the other side. Boy, quoting the Doors. Here we go. But the reality is, I want to take a moment. I mean, this is shortly after Memorial Day, right? And consider all the people that gave up their lives to liberate Europe. I want to tie that process, or the thought behind that, to what I would call a widespread, more underlying issue that perhaps predicated what occurred. And I'm going to ask you, when we get there, I'm going to ask you to disengage the underlying problem. Anytime you talk about National Socialism, there is the targeting of more than one, but at least one specific group that nobody can get past that. And I don't blame them, and it's not wrong. It's just I'm taking this situation out of context. Okay, so I want to leave that aside. We're not commenting on that specific issue one way or the other. It's bad. We all know it's bad. Nobody in their right mind would defend it, but just please leave that to the side for the purpose of today's episode. All right, so here we are. We're talking about the Dozer situation. I just got done watching a long form video on a page called the Lore Lodge. And I found it on YouTube. Basically, the premise is they lied to you. Oh wow. There's something that we never heard before, right? The press and the government lied to you. Yes, well, what happened with the Dozer situation, which is making a reasonable person doing unreasonable things, right? That story is far from over, far from accurate, and I would say I want to give major credit to the guys over there at the Lore Lodge. They did some investigative reporting on their own, and there's a whole lot of things that don't add up. So I would say, first and foremost, go watch their video on the Dozer. I want to say it's about an hour and 20 minutes long. I thought it was fairly even-handed, and it doesn't have any hard conclusions, but it basically blows up the narrative that we've been given for the 20 years, at least the official narrative. Now, I think it's fair to say the average person would immediately dismiss any justification for what went on. And while I can understand that, and I guess largely agree with it, let's just say, for the sake of discussion, for today's episode, we're going to take that piece of the puzzle and set it aside for just a minute, much like the reference to D-Day. So I'm going to attempt to draw a correlation here, not because I'm looking to justify the actions of anybody involved, but just trying to get you to think about it just a little bit differently. So when we look about the cause of D-Day, right? So we had the National Socialists, they took over Germany. Germany then took over most of continental Europe. And what they didn't directly take over, they controlled remotely, essentially. And whatever the underlying fight going on there, for the purposes of today's discussion, that is not relevant. Because what I'm going to talk about is after D-Day, right? We sent a whole lot of guys to go invade Europe, to free Europe. And, you know, in the 80 years since then, we've heard about all the great things that have happened and all the positive outcomes of this. But the folks that went to war, the folks that survived that, they came home different, right? They realized there were tyrants in other parts of the world, and they did terrible things when they were unchecked. That if tyranny is not opposed and not dealt with at the beginning, it will grow and metastasize and become a monster. Now, you know, a couple of years ago, I guess at this point, I did an episode talking about the song Monster. And it's what's interesting to me is, because this is where I'm going to try and tie this together, right? We want to respect the guys that went and fought. But I would imagine a whole lot of those guys didn't necessarily go willingly. I think a lot of them were put in an impossible situation. They felt like it was the right thing to do. They were told it was the right thing to do. They believed they were defending their country. They went and did this, and they ended the obvious tyranny in Europe, and I guess, you know, the European theater and the Asian theater. Then they came home. Having been sent overseas, they came home. And they began to see the seeds of the same tyranny, the same problems in their homeland, their cities, their counties that they lived in. These same veterans now had a much better understanding of what they were dealing with, what the end game was. And they were considering, what are we going to do about this? Now, a great many of them, in fact, I would say the vast majority of them, if you will, they went home, they started families, they enjoyed their life as best they can. Now, I would imagine the majority of these guys had what we would call PTSD now, to one degree or another. But what they had back then is they had a camaraderie, because there were so many guys that experienced this that they could focus on this and they could work through it together with their friends, the VFW or the bullying or whatever. But they never quite moved past the petty tyranny that they observed while they were liberating either Europe or the Asian lands. They were aware of it. It wasn't something they could ignore any longer. It was something that they've had ingrained into them, and a great number of these guys had to disassociate themselves from this in order to function in today's day and age, aka the 1950s, right? Because things are so great in America, we didn't have to deal with all this stuff. But that wasn't exactly true, now was it? Now, you may remember I talked about the Battle of Athens once upon a time, right? Where the veterans fought back against a corrupt government, a county government that was basically run by a bully. And they overthrew it. And then once they accomplished their goal, the veteran party kind of faded away and went into dust. Why? Because people don't want to do that stuff. They just want to be left alone, right? This is the underlying issue. So as I'm transitioning from the idea that we had D-Day to go save Europe, right? We're leaving all the baggage that what went on in Europe, because that's not relevant for the purpose of where we're going today. We're just going to talk about, they saw this petty tyrant stuff. They saw the abuse and all the terrible things that happened under this boot, and they came back home to the States, and then they see it playing out, but at a much lower scale, and they fought back, and they made a difference. When we talk about the idea of the Battle of Athens, they tossed out a corrupt county government. They made a difference, and then once they accomplished that, they wanted to go back home. So now when I think about this, And I keep this in the back of my head, and I go and watch the documentary, essentially, on the guy that built the Killdozer. And I see what he went through over a period of years. 1992 to 2004, I believe, is how long his situation was dragged out. And he had come up against what is essentially low-level tyranny, right? They've been alternately referred to as the Good Old Boys Network, the City Fathers, whatever you want to call it. But they weren't content for themselves to be successful. They weren't content for them to kind of rule the roost. They wanted to put their thumb on the scale and actually prevent anybody else from becoming successful. And that's one of the things I've always cautioned is, hey, look, I live in the city of McKinney. Once upon a time, they had 50, 60,000 people. And the city fathers, they generally looked out for the city. They got a little something out of it. Nobody really cared because the city was growing and it was best for the city. Now at 250,000 people or near to it, we have to look at things a little differently. We can't tolerate certain things. Certain abuses or fast and loose with the rules needs to be put aside because we're going to have to be more even keel. We're going to have to accept that times have changed. But if you go back to 2004, when this is playing out in small town Colorado, the petty tyrants had about run this man into the ground. Now, granted, he did get some money out of it. I'm not going to argue that. He did transfer that money to where these people couldn't get at it. Smart. But the reality is he just wanted to do his business. He just wanted to, do his own thing and be left alone. And through a series of what I would call shady deals, that right was taken away from him. The ability to function was taken away from him. The petty tyrants had intruded and nullified any chance that he had of a peaceful, successful life. Now, most people might, give up and just knuckle under. A good number of people might just say, the heck with it, I'm moving on, I'm getting out of here, I don't want to deal with this, it's not worth my effort. But this guy, from what I can tell, was generally well liked, got along with most of the people, had a life there, and invested his life there. And his reward for that was basically to be dumped on. Now, at this point, he'd exhausted all options. There's nothing left. What's he going to do? I mean, he tried to settle it out with city government, which was aligned against him. He tried to go to court, which, fighting City Hall, not always going to work out your way. More often than not, you lose. But all options are exhausted. And at this point, he's probably come to the conclusion, what am I going to do? I can't just let this stand. I can't tolerate this any further. I'm going to return the favor. I'm going to make them miserable. I'm going to cost them time, money, effort. I'm going to even the odds. I'm going to exact retribution. Now, at this point, there's a whole lot of Christians out there that are saying, well, divine justice comes from the Lord. You don't need to be doing this. And you know what? I believe you're absolutely right. I agree. But to do nothing, to not fight back when you had the opportunity, is what happened here. So if you follow along here, this petty tyranny, this petty abuse of power will grow and will metastasize. It will get worse and worse. And if you don't like the example I used of the National Socialists, use the International Socialists. Look at, China, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Cambodia, half a dozen countries in Africa or South America or Central America. All these are good examples where there were negative outcomes when that petty tyranny was basically codified and made the law of the land. And I look at my own country, I look at these United States, and I got to ask myself, Is that where we're at? So now that I've laid this all out and I've drawn this long, drawn out analogy or connected story or however you want to phrase it, we got to go back. How did we get here? I'm going to say because we did nothing. We were asleep. We tolerated. We just wanted to be left alone. We didn't want to get involved. We thought it would go away, or we thought they'd get enough. We just didn't want to disrupt our lives. You know, the Roman Empire used bread and circuses, and the United States at this late stage of their empire game is doing much the same thing. Or perhaps you can say they're dividing and causing disruptions to keep people distracted. If you don't believe me, do you really think that tranny thing just popped out of nowhere? Do you really think the latest perversion du jour was not prompted? Now, I don't know that there's any deep, dark conspiracy at play here. I can't speak to that. I don't have the research or the knowledge. But I don't believe these things just happen in a vacuum. So, understanding what we're looking at, which is a whole lot of people didn't pay attention. They weren't involved. They wanted to just go about their lives. They wanted to be independent individuals that were checked out from the system. Some would call it hyper-individualism. I don't know if that's a fair statement or not. I think it's just a I want to be left alone mentality. The I want to be left alone mentality, it's a big thing, particularly in the western part of the United States. Just leave me alone. And if only that would work that way, right? If only that was really truly an option, but it's not anymore. So while you saw the worst of humanity coming out of the national and international socialists, and we saw just a microcosm scale of this play out with this guy in Granby, Colorado. But he got even, or at least in his own mind, he evened the ledger, right? Now, how do you prevent this disaster, right? Let me present you a couple of ideas. Well, 1, you need to be involved. 2, you need to be awake. And 3, you need to take action. So if you're involved, you can prevent some of this abuse. You can intervene when it's necessary. If you're awake, you see it. You're aware. You can let others know. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen in the dark. And if you're taking action, that means not only did you see it, did you know it, and you're involved in it, now you're pushing back, or you're trying to prevent it from metastasizing. Now, not everything is the same, right? Not all evil is the same amount of evil, but it's still evil. Not everything is the worst case scenario, but sometimes a bad scenario is still a bad scenario and needs to be dealt with. And this directly correlates with the idea that power corrupts. So a small town that's essentially run by a singular family or a singular faction, they gain that power, they maintain that power, and it's just really never not enough, right? It's never not. It's really never enough. They cannot be satiated. More. To the extent they have to take from somebody else. Now, if we lived in a less litigious lifestyle, right? If we lived in a more, I don't know, maybe agrarian, pioneer-spirited, people would be solving this stuff. It'd be maybe fisticuffs or maybe duels. Not sure I'm a huge fan of either solution, but you wouldn't be able to get away with a lot of this stuff. Nobody would tolerate it. I mean, how would you feel if they told you, we're going to take a bunch of your money, we're going to make you do certain things, and if you don't do those certain things, we're going to take a bunch more of your money. Oh, and by the way, we're going to go ahead and either take your property or reassess your property to where you can't afford to stay on your property. Now, logic would dictate you've really got three options here, right? Do nothing and get crushed, flee, or fight back. And fight like there's no tomorrow, because quite frankly, under that circumstance, there isn't really much of a tomorrow for you. So when you're dealing with corrupt powers, the real question is, are you bound by those rules? Are you bound by the rules of decorum? Are you bound by the rules of virtue when you're about to be crushed under the heel of a tyrant? You know, they talked about in the Revolutionary War that it was inappropriate the way that Francis Marion and some of those guys were fighting. You know, that was unbecoming. That was not proper warfare, whatever their excuses were. But did they win? Did they achieve their goals? And if you're winning, does it really matter what your opponent thinks of it? Sometimes it, you know, the old adage, right? It's not whether you win or lose, it's whether you win comes into play here. When you're dealing with a tyrant, should you treat them as a fair, even-handed person would, or should you treat them like they would treat you? Right? Kind of the inverse of the golden rule, right? You're supposed to treat people how you would like to be treated, but is it fair or appropriate at times to treat somebody how they are treating you? Now, once again, I know some of the Christians out there are probably wringing their hands and getting upset because I'm advocating something terrible. Well, I'm really not. I'm just asking you to consider, if you know that this is tyranny, and if you know this tyranny is going to have terrible consequences, at what point is it appropriate for you to take action to put an end to the tyranny? Is a little action now, which would end the further problems, warranted, or do you wait until you have no other choice? Do you wait until it's liberty or death? What if you can fix the problem before it comes to that? What if you can intervene and prevent this issue? These are things we need to consider. These are things we need to be aware of, but we have to have at least an idea how we might approach it. We have to be willing to accept that it's not always perfectly easy and clean. Just like in war, right? The folks that stormed the beaches in Normandy, there was a whole lot of killing going on there. And I'm not sure they gave a whole lot of thought to it. And be quite honest with you, being face down with a mortar fire, machine gun fire, bombers, fighters, strafing, whatever, and surviving that, I'm not really going to feel a lot of pity for that German guy that throws up his hands to surrender at the last minute. I mean, I know what my training is. I know what the right thing is. But after all that, I don't really know how I'd react. And I would suggest to you that you really don't know either. So I admire the restraint that apparently most of our soldiers had, because they went through all that and there just wasn't a mass slaughter. When they surrendered, they surrendered. So I admire that. I don't know what I would do. But that was the grand metastasized tyranny. And here we're just talking about a little local tin pot tyrant. How do you deal with that? How do you remove it? What's the proper course of action? Is there a set answer? Is there a possibility that there's a number of infinite variables that could be used to come up to a proper solution? I mean, this is the kind of thing that you need to think about. You need to be able to wrap your head about. You need to be prepared to make that decision at the time, but you can't make that decision at the time if you haven't pre-thought about it. Now, I could tell you, fortunately, no matter how bad McKinney may seem, we don't necessarily have a petty tyranny here. We have bad ideas sometimes. We have bad actions sometimes. But there are some significant checks and balances. And while you can argue that the elections aren't exactly fair, I would just say the reason that you lose might have as much to do with you as the person that won. You have to reevaluate what's the proper course of action. You have to know ahead of time. You have to get into a fight and know what you're willing to do in order to win. You have to stay true to your principles. You have to fight the good fight. You have to make sure you don't become the monster you're looking to defeat. But on the flip side, to fight a monster, you have to have a warrior. So once again, revisiting the prior issue here, if you're invading Normandy, you don't send a bunch of librarians. You send warriors. Likewise, at the end of the day, you've exhausted all options and they're destroying you. Perhaps it is appropriate to quit playing nice guy. Perhaps it is appropriate to take those gut shots when you can. Now, you can feel free to disagree with me at this point. I'm not advocating anybody take any action here. I'm not suggesting that this is a good idea. I'm not suggesting anybody break any laws. I'm merely asking you to think about it. Because whatever tyranny you perceive now, I can guarantee you it's going to be worse. Whatever slighted world that you think we live in right now, I can guarantee you it's going to be worse. Whatever shortcoming or misgivings you might have about the current life that we enjoy in these United States, let me assure you, it's going to get worse. Maybe you don't agree with a Texas independence movement. I get it. And maybe you're concerned that those tyrants closer to home are potentially worse than the tyrants over in D.C. I get it. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? What's your answer? And if you don't have an answer, perhaps you ought to get one. And with that, this has been According to Callus, and yes, it's going to be late today. And I will see you on the other side.